Welcome back to Mornings with Zerlina. Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan represents Virginia's 4th District and is back with us. Good morning, Congresswoman.
Good morning.
So I want to talk about the SAVE Act because it's one of those things that we've been flagging since the beginning of this administration. We know it was in Project 2025. We know what they wanted to do, but what is the SAVE Act and how would it impact Americans' ability to vote?
So basically, it would say everyone has to prove their citizenship before they're able to register to vote and before they can vote. And that's not just, bring a photo ID. You have to have certain government issued photo IDs, all of which cost money, whether it's a passport, whether it is a driver's license, every single one costs money. There are about 21 million American citizens that don't have these documents. And then if you are military, you have a free ID, but you have to present them in person. So it effectively eliminates vote and registration by mail. It puts these barriers in the way, particularly of women if you change your name, if you're in a rural area. But it's also a modern day poll tax because, as I said, every ID you can use costs money. And so basically, it is the exact same poll tax that my grandfather had to pay to register to vote. And it's a voter suppression tactic.
I was just going to say this sounds a lot like a poll tax when you're talking about a financial barrier to being able to vote, which should not be in place. I mean, the Supreme Court, I feel like we already asked and answered this question. We already said that this is not lawful. How are they able to even put forward this legislation and get
Because they're
away
not
with
at
it?
there because they're pretending it's not a poll tax.
Mm,
They didn't say outright it was a poll tax. They say, oh, you just have to present your documents, and show that you're a citizen. That's reasonable, right? Everybody has documents, but they don't talk about the fact that they cost money. They don't want to. And not only has the Supreme Court said that's illegal, but the 24th Amendment to the Constitution says it's
that's
illegal.
right.
But they, once again, are ignoring the Constitution.
Let's talk about the impact on women because this is getting a lot of attention, but it's for a good reason. If you're married and you change your name, your documents are not going to all have the same name on them. I mean, talk a bit about the voter suppression of specifically married women, which last I checked includes a lot of Republicans.
A lot, yes, that's exactly right. Married women who change their name. What do you need to get most of these documents? You need your birth certificate. And you basically would have to show the chain of custody. So you got to bring your birth certificate, you got to bring your marriage license, and sort of prove here's the whole chain of custody of my name and why it's not the same on my birth certificate as it is on these documents that I'm presenting to you in person. Again, so you got to pay for a copy of your birth certificate. Most people don't keep them handy. You got to pay for a copy of your marriage certificate, and you have to bring them in person to the registrar's office to register to vote. And then you got to make sure you bring them with you to vote.
And it also feels like the requirement of a passport in some instances is also a barrier, right? Because number one, a passport costs money. I think like more than $100.
Yes,
Then also, most Americans don't have a passport. I mean, that's one of the
that's
facts
right.
that I cite all the time in other conversations. But most Americans are not, don't have their passport. They're not traveling all around the world. It
Exactly.
feels like these barriers are specifically being set up to suppress the vote. How are they making the argument to their base? I mean, how are they getting away with this argument to their base? Is it just that they're claiming that this is to prevent so-called voter fraud?
That's exactly right. They're claiming that all these people have showed up who are not American citizens, who are not who they claim to be, uh, voting. And first of all, that's already illegal. And if they have evidence of that, and there's very little evidence of that to begin with, those people can be prosecuted and put in jail. And so I think this is just like, after Reconstruction, in the
Hmm.
name of citizenship and voter integrity, they put all of these barriers, whether it was a literacy test or a poll tax, to make, people jump through these hoops. And they left it to the local election officials. And so in the case of my great grandfather, who had to take a literacy test, It was up to the registrar whether they got the questions right or not. And if they got the questions right, they could bring more questions. It was exactly what happened to my great grandfather. And so these local officials can decide whether the documents you bring are sufficient or not. They don't talk about that. They also don't talk about the fact that this bill would give the federal government more access to voter rolls, to voter
Mm.
registration information. And in some cases where states don't require you to put your full social security number, they're making you do that to give the federal government, i.e. the Trump administration, more access to your voting records. They're not talking about any of this. They're only using their talking points about how this is going to keep uh, people from engaging in voter fraud, non-citizens from voting, when all of that is already illegal and there's very little evidence that it's happening widespread.
I mean, is this the way that they tried to rig the upcoming midterm elections? Obviously, we've been talking on the show a lot about the raid on Fulton County and this, confiscation of the ballots from an election that happened 6 years ago. But I think looking forward to the midterm elections and also the 2028 cycle, changing laws around voting, confiscating ballots, and having access to this type of information, this is the way that they try to mess with the election, right?
One way, yes. And you remember the president said he wants to nationalize federal elections. They're seizing voter information. They're talking about putting ICE agents at polling places so you could see, like we saw in Jim Crow era, people with guns at the polling place to intimidate voters, all of which is illegal because this is all about voter suppression. And it's not new. The Heritage Foundation has been wanting to do this for years. When I was in the state legislature, 20 years ago, they were trying to do some form of government issue photo ID bill because they want to make it harder for people to vote because they know their ideas are not popular.
I mean, emphasis on ideas are not popular. I mean, they're polling right now for the president, approval of the White House, very like in the dumps. Like, I understand why they would want to suppress the vote. What I don't understand is how they're getting away with it without too much backlash.
Because people aren't paying attention to the details of what this bill does. They don't come out and say you got to pay for these IDs. It's only because I asked the question. I asked my staff, all of these forms of ID that they have, are any of them free? And they went and they did the research and they found that they range, some as high as $1,500. And the only one again that's free is a military ID, but you got to present it in person. And if you're not deployed where you're registered to vote or where you want to register to vote, that's going to be very difficult.
Yeah. Right now, y'all are going on recess, and you haven't reached a deal to avert a partial government shutdown, and that will impact TSA and FEMA, and other agencies within the Department of Homeland Security. Talk a bit about why Democrats held together, stayed unified on DHS funding, and what are the sticking points that you were not able to come to an agreement on to avert the partial shutdown?
It is very clear that DHS and ICE and Border Patrol are out of control. The fact that you had two American citizens killed by DSS federal agents, the fact that you have ICE terrorizing our communities, there's a public safety crisis that they created. Over 30 people have died in their custody since Trump came to office. And the American people have seen that. Everybody who was snowed in and watched the murder of Alex Preddy, are like, enough is enough. And so we have a list of reforms that are very necessary, that are reasonable, that apply to every other law enforcement agency. No masks, show your ID, no warrantless arrests, comply with the Constitution. Detain people in humane conditions, not in warehouses that are basically concentration camps. And some of, the White House is now engaged in negotiations, which shows they know they have a problem. But so far, they have not really been serious about these reforms that are popular with the American people, that apply to every other law enforcement agency, and really needs to rein in an out of control agency that looks more like a paramilitary force in our streets than something that's supposed to enforce immigration laws and protect our borders.
And the context of all this is happening is the Epstein files, I think is the larger context of so many of these conversations and things that are in the headlines. And we've seen Pam Bondi in front of the House Judiciary Committee with her burn book. We've also talked to members of Congress who have seen the unredacted versions of these files. I mean, when you think about the importance of accountability and transparency when it comes to the people who did wrong, they need to be investigated. We're really the only country in the world that has people in the files that have no investigations opened into any of the people in the files. I mean, what does it say about the state of our country and our democracy?
Well, it shows, first of all, that the president lied when he said that he was going to release the Epstein files, when he played into conspiracy theories that a lot of his base had, and said that he was going to be open and transparent, and then gets in office and oops, he's told his name is in them, and then decides, no, we're not going to be transparent. And they have done everything they can to try to keep these files from being released, because when we what we're seeing is very powerful, important people who were preying on women and children, and they need to be held accountable, and just like ICE needs to be held accountable for its lawlessness and the deaths that they've caused as a result.
I mean, that context is important as well. I've been thinking a lot about how the reason why they're justifying ISIS treatment of communities of color is because they're supposedly, this is not true, but they're supposedly going after the worst of the worst, right? The
And
worst
not
criminals, the human traffickers, if you will, right? That was actually the reason they're blowing up boats in the Caribbean is because of drug trafficking and human trafficking. And yet, when you have evidence of human trafficking of children allegedly in these files, they're doing nothing about that. I mean, it's worse than hypocrisy.
that's exactly right. And it's, I don't understand how what they're trying to do is just criminalize the act of being an undocumented immigrant, which is not a crime. They're trying to dehumanize immigrants and including American citizens. And yet the actual criminals who, traffic human beings, traffic children, rape children, they're not willing to hold accountable. It really shows their value set. It really shows that they don't value human beings unless they somehow can do something for them.
Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan, Democratic representative for Virginia's 4th District. Thank you so much for being back with us. Come back very soon.
Thank you.